Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabesy here. This is the raid guide for Normal and Heroic Flamebender Kagraz. This fight is moderately difficult. There are quite a few mechanics you have to deal with, but luckily it's just a repeated pattern, so you can quickly get used to it, and then it just comes down to basic practice, and it's pretty simple from there. So let's get started. For your raid composition, you'll want the standard 2 tanks and probably 1 to 1 1/4 healers for every 5 people in the raid. The healing requirement on the fight overall is not too high, but there are some areas where damage can be fairly spiky, which can be a problem. So plan around that. In terms of DPS, a good mix is always preferable, really. I will mention that melee DPS have some distinct advantages in that most of the mechanics they get to ignore on this fight. So if you're able to stack more melee DPS, that will increase your overall damage. But you do need enough range to deal with one of the ranged targets that will occur throughout the fight. We'll talk about later. Alright, so the first thing to establish before you even pull is the basic positioning of the raid. And here you can see a top-down view diagram of kind of how we decided to position things after a little bit of planning and trial and error. So you can see in the center there, the red square is just the boss, Flamebender, main tank at the bottom, off tank in the top left, melee stack is the orange circle in the top right in melee. And then you can see along the sort of front half of the room, we have a bunch of positions for ranged and healers. Obviously, you want to make sure you disperse your healers so that everyone, is in range to get healed by at least 2 people, essentially. And then the other thing is you'll probably need to stack up 2 people in one position. So you can see the distance markers sort of indicate the distances. You want to make sure that the corner players, those in the back, in the front right and front left, are basically at max range from what they need to do. So max range if they're DPS from the targets, or max heal range from the off tank and the melee if they're healers. And then other than that, between 2 sets of ranged players, you need a gap of about 11 yards or slightly more. But 11 yards is a safe distance. So if you can be over 10 from every position, then you'll be okay. And with these basic setups, you can then be prepared for basically every mechanic that happens in the fight. So if you look around in the footage here, you can kind of see that we started to use raid markers with roughly these distances. And at each raid marker, we essentially have a pair of 2 ranged players, either 2 DPS or a healer and a DPS stacked up. And as we get through the actual mechanics of the fight, you'll see why these positions will be useful for you. Now, when you begin the encounter, you'll be facing Aknor Steelbringer, along with Flamebender as well. Aknor just needs to be tanked by your off tank and faced away from the melee. He has a cleave sort of attack that's short radius. Otherwise, your DPS should focus him down first. There's no benefit to keep him alive, assuming you're not doing the achievement, which you shouldn't be if you're just first learning this fight. And otherwise, he's very easy to kill. He's very low health. So just kill him off quickly, and then you move on to the rest of the actual encounter. So Flamebender has 2 core mechanics that you'll use throughout the entire fight. See, the first of which is Lava Slash, which will target a random ranged player or healer and create a fire line between the boss and the player. So you can see the straight fire lines coming from the boss position out to the targeting areas. These lines don't last indefinitely, but they do last a fair bit of time. So the basic mechanic here is because of your spread out positions, the 1 or 2 people that were targeted simply sidestep just a yard or 2 to get out of the lava line, and that's it. The actual impact damage is pretty minor because it's only going to hit those 1 or 2 people at once, so you don't have to worry about it too much. It's also worth noting that you will have to run across the lines at some point as your ranged players have to kite or whatnot. It's not a huge deal if you just step through one quickly, just taking 1 tick of it. And some players in the raid even reported being able to jump over them to avoid the damage. So if that's true, that's great, of course, but running through them briefly is not a huge issue. The other core ability that you'll see is Summon Enchanted Armament, or Summon a Weapon, as I like to call it. So basically, Flamebender will target a random ranged player, and she will throw a weapon at that player's location. That weapon will stay there essentially for the remainder of the fight and deal damage every few seconds to anyone within about 6 yards of it. So this is all the more reason for those spread out positions that we talked about. Here we look at a top-down view again, and now you can see that, as an example, one of the players in the bottom left, or one of the stack points in the bottom left, was targeted with a weapon. In this case, that player or players that are stacked there simply step forward just a few yards to get out of the weapon radius. And this forces those weapons to be all the way against the wall whenever possible. And if they're targeted against a wall, then you move forward. And if you get another weapon, then you move forward with that, and so on. So overall, it's a pretty simple process. You won't see weapons that often, but if you do, it's an easy way to deal with them. So now that we've talked about the core mechanics, we'll talk about the special mechanics, which are based on Flamebender's current Molten Energy level. This energy just goes up over time. You cannot affect the rate. And she essentially gains energy a little bit slower than 1 energy per second. So you can plan on her reaching every 25 interval mark every 30 seconds. So 30 seconds into the fight, she'll reach 25. Then another 30 seconds, she'll reach 50, and so on. Every 25 energy that she gains uses a new special ability in her arsenal until she reaches 100 energy, uses her ultimate ability, so to speak, and then resets back to 0, and the process repeats. The first energy mechanic is Molten Torrent at 25. So if you look in the bottom right of the screen, you can see our Elemental Shaman coming in, and he has a large circle around him, which indicates Molten Torrent. It's a 6-second debuff targeted on a random range player, and after the 6 seconds expire, that player will deal very heavy fire damage to themselves and split it with anyone within the circle. So, just like you probably used to in many other mechanics, the idea is to split this damage with a large group of players. The easiest way we found to deal with it is just run it into the melee pack, soak it between you, all the melee DPS, and the tanks, and that's it. Pretty simple. If you are able to solo it with an immunity or maybe a 90% damage reduction cooldown, something like that, you're free to do so. Just make sure you are far enough away from other players that, it won't kill anybody else, essentially. Now at 50 energy, you will see Cinder Wolf pairs. And these are by far the most important mechanic in the fight. Handling these properly is really the key to this encounter. When they initially spawn, one of the wolves will immediately become overheated, and this wolf will then be tauntable and have normal threat mechanics, and you need to quickly have a tank pick it up and face it away from the rest of the raid. Meanwhile, the other wolf, the smaller one at the time, will fixate on a random ranged player and chase that player around for 10 seconds. After the fixate ends, it will select a new random target to fixate on and repeat the process over and over. After a short period of both these wolves being active, they will swap roles. The smaller one will become overheated, the other one will lose its overheated debuff, and at that point, the tanks need to quickly pick up the now newly overheated one, face it away just like before. So here you can see a top-down view again, showing how the wolves are managed. So basic positions are pretty much the same, but in the center we're just showing the current overpowered or overheated wolf that's being tanked by the off tank in the top left and faced to that top left direction. And you can see that large cone of breath indicates the breath attack that the overheated wolf uses fairly frequently. Making sure that this is faced away from everyone else is critical because this does severe fire damage and it also stacks, increasing future breath attacks by 200%. What this means is that your tanks need to swap according to the overheated application, essentially. So you almost want to essentially plan for one initial tank, your off tank, to pick up the overheated wolf when it first spawns in the pair, face it away just like normal, and hold it until the wolves swap roles. When the smaller one becomes overheated and the previous overheated one becomes small, then you tank swap at the same time. So you would essentially always have the tanks on the same pretty much assigned wolf. If you try to swap just after a breath occurs, you'll probably run into taunt issues or positioning issues. We found it was easier to simply taunt when the new, or basically when the wolves swap their overheated status. And so then the main tank would taunt the newly overheated one, put it in the off-tank position, the off-tank would move out, and just keep repeating this process until they're dead. Meanwhile, you can also see that the along the right side there is a random range player that's targeted with a T by the wolf. That's a fixated person, so their basic role is to just move toward the other side of the room. Wherever they happen to start, they move to the opposite side of the room and swing the wolf around so that it doesn't catch up with them, and after the 10-second period is over, it'll fixate on someone else, and the process repeats. This allows for, in general terms at least, the melee to avoid getting touched by the fire in all times. I also noticed that the position you see in the video for melee and the off-tank are opposite. They're switched. But it doesn't matter. We have the off-tank in the top right instead of the top left, and melee in the top left instead of the top right. But the idea still is the same. If you do this properly, melee and the off-tank can be essentially out of the fire line of the kiting wolf pretty much at all times. The exception is when they initially spawn in pairs, in which case your melee either need to back off a little bit, or they can just soak it up and get hit by the fire line a little bit. It doesn't actually do that much damage with just a couple stacks. The last thing to note is that the wolves need to be killed pretty much simultaneously. And because they're going to be alternating positions, generally the idea is your ranged kill the one that's being kited if they're in range of it. Otherwise they can attack the one in melee. And melee, of course, just kill the one in melee. Because the wolves will swap back and forth where they're standing as they come from non-heated to overheated, you can adjust your damage accordingly. If you kill one of the wolves, it gets down to low health, it will start to rekindle over 8 seconds. If the other wolf in the pair is not killed within that 8-second time frame, the rekindling wolf will heal itself up, and that's pretty much game over. The reason it's a problem is because if the boss is allowed to reach 100 energy for her final big ability, while a wolf is active, the wolf will also use the same big ability, and having 2 of those going off at once, or even 3, is just dead. You'll just be wiping. So you have to kill the wolves quickly and efficiently, but at the same time. So make sure you communicate which wolves are getting low, stop your DPS on one or the other if you need to, and then finish them off. You can take your time so long as you kill them before the boss reaches that 50 energy mark. So you have a little bit under 1 minute from when they spawn to finish them both off. The next ability on the docket is at 75 energy, and this is Blazing Radiance. Once again, this targets a random range player. That player will be debuffed for 10 seconds, during which time they will pulse fire damage to anyone within 10 yards, including themselves, every 2 seconds. The basic method for handling this is just like we talked about at the beginning. It's basic positioning. If you are targeted with Blazing Radiance and you are by yourself, you can just stand there because you should be at least 11 yards or more away from other players. If you are stacked with somebody else, make sure you communicate with your partner that you have the debuff and they can move away from you, just temporarily. It's better for your partner or partners to move away than for you to move away, because if you move away, you could threaten hitting other people unintentionally. Whereas they can safely move anywhere they want because they're not afflicted with something. So overall, pretty simple ability to deal with. Again, it's just mostly due to the spread out positioning of ranged players to begin with. Now finally, once Flamebender reaches 100 energy, she will use Firestorm. And this is her sort of ultimate, where she will channel for 12 seconds and do pretty heavy fire damage to the entire raid during this period. Afterwards, she will reset back to 0 energy, and the entire process will pretty much repeat. So, easiest way to handle this we found is once her energy gets high, around say 95 plus, have people start moving forward, but there's going to be one more application of one of her bad debuffs, usually Blazing Radiance. So that player that's afflicted with Blazing Radiance obviously cannot stack, but everyone else can come into melee range and stack up for more efficient cooldowns and heals and all that good stuff. And otherwise just use outside healing on the player that has to be out if necessary. And that's pretty much it. Firestorm is actually quite easy to deal with, assuming your raid is, able to mitigate the mechanics prior, and you can just stack up and heal through it. As mentioned before in the wolf section, the wolves do need to be dead before she reaches this point, because otherwise they will also cast Firestorm, and that will kill you. So just make sure you get them down in time. Now, once the boss finishes her first Firestorm, she gets one last ability, which is a fairly minor consideration, but just be aware of it. This is Magma Monsoon. You'll notice on the left side of the screen there, above her fire pool, there are all these little fireballs waiting, and every once in a while one of them will fire off. These target random players in the raid. They can target melee and ranged, and they will do fire damage to anyone within about 3 yards of their impact point. You can sidestep to dodge them. It's not a huge amount of damage if you get hit. The best way we found to deal with it was essentially just to let ranged players just sit there and soak the damage and not really worry about it. Melee do probably need to move because there's so many of you stacked up, but it's pretty easy to do. And that's pretty much it. This ability only lasts for about 30 seconds until the orbs are no longer active and she's run out of them. And it won't happen again until after the next Firestorm ends and just repeats. So, like I said, if you are able to have just singular range spots or maybe even pairs like we're doing here, you can probably just soak the damage and not worry about it. We didn't want to have to move side to side too much because it would affect people's ability to avoid other mechanics a little bit. But if you want to sidestep it, you certainly can do so. And there you have it. That is the entire raid guide for Normal Heroic Flamebender Kagraz. Overall, like I said, moderately difficult. The main thing is really getting your tanks to quickly handle the wolves, doing the swaps when the new one overheats, having your ranged and healers spread out appropriately and avoid the targeted mechanics, running in for Torrent, and otherwise just mitigating damage when you can. And it seems like a lot, but like I said, it's all in order. It's all phase-based, really, so you get used to it pretty quickly. Anyway, that is the whole guide. Thank you for watching, as always. Good luck, and I'll see you next time. I don't even understand what Flamebender means. How do you bend flames, exactly? They seem very bent already. I guess you're just a wizard, Harry.